I discovered the bright orange envelope tucked under my windshield wiper on a Tuesday morning in February, and my stomach immediately sank because nothing good ever came in those HOA violation notices. The temperature in Billings, Montana had dropped to -8 degrees overnight, and I'd done what any reasonable person would do: started my truck 15 minutes early to let it warm up before heading to work at the construction site. Now, apparently, that was a crime worth $100 fine. My name is Frank Paulson, and I'd been living in the Meadowbrook Heights subdivision for 3 years. It was one of those cookie-cutter neighborhoods that sprouted up on the edge of town, where every house looked vaguely similar, and the HOA ruled with an iron fist wrapped in passive-aggressive newsletters. I pulled the citation from under the wiper blade, my fingers already going numb in the cold, and read through the typed notice with growing disbelief. Violation of HOA Code Section 7.3.2. Idling vehicle unattended. Resident observed allowing vehicle to run unattended in driveway for extended period. This creates noise pollution, environmental concerns, and potential security risks. First offense, $100 fine. Payment due within 30 days. I stood there in my driveway, breath forming clouds in the frigid air, and read it twice more. Noise pollution. My truck wasn't exactly a hot rod. Security risks. In this neighborhood where everyone knew everyone else's business down to what brand of toilet paper they bought. I crumpled the notice in my fist and headed back inside, already late for work, and now thoroughly pissed off. The citation was signed by Linda Carmichael, the HOA president and undisputed queen of Meadowbrook Heights. Linda was a 52-year-old woman with a blonde bob that never moved in the wind, and an endless collection of pastel sweater sets that she wore like armor. She'd retired early from some middle management position, and had apparently decided that micromanaging the neighborhood was her new calling in life. Her house sat at the corner of Willow Lane and Meadowbrook Drive, positioned perfectly to monitor traffic coming and going from the main entrance. I'd had run-ins with Linda before, though nothing major. She'd once left me a note about my garbage cans being visible from the street 3 hours past the designated pickup time. Another time, she'd knocked on my door to inform me that my lawn was a 1/4 inch longer than the HOA guidelines permitted. I'd always been polite, fixed whatever minor issue she'd identified, and moved on with my life. But this felt different. This felt personal and ridiculous in a way that made my blood pressure spike. That evening, after a long day of framing walls in weather that made my tools stick to my bare hands, I drove home past Linda's house and noticed something that would change everything. Her silver Lexus sat in the driveway with the hood propped open, and she stood next to it with her phone pressed to her ear, looking frustrated. As I slowed down, being neighborly despite my irritation, she waved me down with frantic gestures. I rolled down my window, letting the hard-earned heat escape from my truck cab. Problem? Oh, Frank, thank goodness. My battery died, and the towing company says they can't get here for 2 hours. I have a very important meeting with the Architectural Review Committee in 40 minutes. Linda's voice had that edge of panic that came from someone whose carefully controlled world was experiencing a hiccup. I had jumper cables in my truck bed. I'd had them there for years because Montana winters were brutal, and I'd lost count of how many times I'd helped jump-start vehicles for neighbors, co-workers, and random strangers in parking lots. It was just what you did when you lived somewhere that regularly dropped below zero. I opened my mouth to say I'd help, then stopped. The orange violation notice was sitting on my passenger seat, a bright reminder of Linda's priorities. Sorry, Linda, I've got to get home. I started rolling up my window. "Wait, what? Frank, please, this will only take 5 minutes." Her voice went up an octave, that Karen-esque tone emerging that made demands sound like questions. "Can't help. Wouldn't want to create any noise pollution or security risks by having my truck running unattended while I hook up the cables." I kept my voice level and polite, but the message was clear. Linda's face went through several interesting color changes, from pale to pink to an angry red. "That's completely different and you know it. Is it?" Because the citation I received this morning didn't make any exceptions for temperature or common sense. I gave her a small wave and pulled away, watching in my rearview mirror as she stood in her driveway, mouth hanging open in shock. I felt a petty sense of satisfaction that lasted exactly until I pulled into my own driveway and saw my neighbor, Robert Chen, walking over with a concerned expression. Robert lived 2 houses down and worked from home as some kind of software engineer. He was in his early 30s like me, and we'd bonded over beers and football games during the warmer months. "Hey man, I saw you got hit with a citation this morning," Robert said, shoving his hands in his pockets against the cold. "Linda was making the rounds early, I guess." "Yeah, apparently warming up my truck is against the rules now." I climbed out, grabbing my lunch box and thermos. "That's ridiculous. It's been below 0 all week." Robert glanced around, lowering his voice even though no one else was outside in this weather. "Between you and me, I think she's on some kind of power trip." She cited the Hendersons for having their Christmas lights up past January 10th, and she tried to fine the Martins for having a basketball hoop in their driveway, even though half the houses here have them. What happened with that? Martin's a lawyer. He sent her a 10-page letter explaining exactly how that wasn't covered under any HOA covenant and threatening legal action if she pursued it. She backed off real quick. Robert grinned, then his expression turned more serious. "Look, I heard she's planning to propose even stricter rules at the next board meeting. Something about approved paint colors and limitations on vehicles parked in driveways overnight. You've got to be kidding me." I wish I was. "The meeting's next Thursday at the community center." "You should come. We need normal people there to push back on this stuff." I promised I'd think about it, and Robert headed back to his house. I went inside, cranked up the heat, and made myself dinner while mentally calculating whether fighting a $100 fine was worth the hassle. By the time I'd finished eating, I'd decided to pay it and move on with my life. It wasn't worth the stress. But the next morning when I went out to start my truck, I found another orange envelope. This time the citation was for excessive window frost, claiming that my vehicle windows being frosted over created a visual blight on the neighborhood aesthetic. Another $100 fine. That was it. That was the moment I decided Linda Carmichael had picked the wrong person to mess with. I drove to work with my jaw clenched so tight I gave myself a headache. My coworker, Miguel, noticed immediately when I showed up to the job site. "Who died?" he asked, handing me a cup of coffee from the thermos he always brought. I showed him both citations. Miguel read them, his eyebrows climbing higher with each line, then let out a low whistle. "Man, your HOA lady is loca. Frosted windows, that's just winter." "I know. And now I'm out $200 for literally doing nothing wrong. You gonna fight it? I don't know. Probably not worth it." But even as I said it, I knew I was lying. It was absolutely worth it, not because of the money, but because of the principle. Over the next week, I watched carefully and noticed something interesting. Linda drove around the neighborhood every single morning around 7, doing what I could only describe as violation patrols. She'd creep along at 5 miles per hour, head swiveling back and forth, looking for any possible infraction. And when the temperature dropped again that Friday night, plummeting to -15, I made sure to be up early Saturday morning to watch the show. Sure enough, around 8:30, I saw Linda walking up to 3 different houses, tucking orange envelopes under windshield wipers. Tom Harrison across the street, the Kowalski family 2 doors down, even elderly Mrs. Patterson, who was 83 and lived alone after her husband passed. All of them had been warming up their vehicles in the brutal cold. By Monday morning, my phone was ringing off the hook. First, Robert called, having received his own citation for warming up his SUV. Then Tom Harrison stopped by before work, citation in hand, asking if I knew a good lawyer. By Monday evening, a small group had gathered in Robert's living room. Me, Robert, Tom, Jennifer Kowalski, and a guy named Marcus Webb who lived on the next street over. "This is getting out of control," Jennifer said, pacing back and forth. She was a nurse who worked 12-hour shifts at the hospital and needed to warm up her car before driving in at 5 in the morning for patient safety reasons. "I got cited twice in 3 days. That's $200 for making sure I don't die of hypothermia on my commute." "Has anyone actually read through the entire HOA covenant?" Marcus asked. He was a high school teacher with a methodical mind and wire-rimmed glasses that he kept pushing up his nose. "I mean, really read it, not just the summary they gave us when we moved in." None of us had. Marcus had brought his copy, a thick binder with page after page of rules, regulations, and bylaws. We spent the next 2 hours going through it, and what we discovered was illuminating. The rule Linda kept citing about idling vehicles was incredibly vague, written broadly enough that it could be interpreted multiple ways. But more importantly, there were specific procedures the HOA had to follow when issuing fines, including providing photographic evidence, allowing residents to contest citations before a review board, and giving warnings for first-time offenses of minor violations. "She didn't follow any of this," Tom said, flipping through the pages. "Look, right here. Section 12.4. First-time violations of Category C offenses, which includes noise and environmental concerns, require a written warning, not a fine. Fines only apply after a warning is issued and the violation continues." "So these fines are basically invalid?" I asked, feeling that petty satisfaction building again. "Not just invalid. According to this section here, HOA board members who issue fines not in accordance with the covenant procedures can be removed from the board by a vote of the homeowners." Marcus looked up, a small smile playing at his lips. "And it only takes 20% of homeowners to call for a special election. We had 147 homes in Meadowbrook Heights. We needed 30 homeowner signatures to trigger a vote." Looking around Robert's living room at the 5 of us, all holding illegitimate citations, I figured we could probably manage that. "I'm in," Jennifer said immediately. "Linda's been a nightmare since she took over as president 2 years ago. Remember when she tried to ban everyone from parking on the street overnight, even though half of us have 2-car garages and 3 vehicles? Or when she demanded everyone replace their mailboxes with approved models that cost $300 each?" Robert added. The stories kept coming, and I realized that Linda's vendetta wasn't unique to me or even to the vehicle warming issue. She'd been systematically alienating residents for years with increasingly petty and often baseless citations. Most people had just paid the fines to avoid conflict, not realizing they had any recourse. We split up the neighborhood between the 5 of us and agreed to spend the next week gathering signatures. I took my street and the 2 adjacent ones, which included Linda's block. That was going to be interesting. Tuesday after work, I started knocking on doors. The Hendersons were home first, and Mary Henderson answered with a baby on her hip and a toddler clinging to her leg. When I explained what we were doing, her face lit up. Finally, someone standing up to her. She cited us for having our garbage cans visible on Christmas Day because we forgot to bring them in before the pickup deadline. Christmas Day. I was hosting 14 family members and dealing with a newborn. The last thing on my mind was garbage cans. Mary signed immediately and told me to hit up the Patels next door, who'd been fined for having a garden gnome that was apparently not on the approved lawn decoration list. By Thursday evening, I had 17 signatures just from my section. Robert texted that he had 12. Jennifer had 9, Tom had 8, and Marcus had 7. We were 3 signatures away from our goal. I'd been avoiding Linda's immediate neighbors, unsure how they'd react, but I was running out of options. I walked up to the house directly next to Linda's, belonging to George and Patricia Walsh. George answered, a retired military man in his 60s with a crew cut gone silver and shoulders that still looked like they could carry a full pack. Frank Paulson, right? 2 streets over. George had a firm handshake and direct eye contact. Yes, sir. I wanted to talk to you about Linda Carmichael and some HOA issues we've been having. I went through my now practiced explanation about the invalid citations and the petition for a special election. George listened without interrupting, then called over his shoulder. Patricia, come here a minute. Patricia appeared, wiping her hands on a dish towel. George explained what I'd told him, and I watched Patricia's expression transform from curious to absolutely furious. That woman, Patricia said, her voice tight with controlled anger, cited us last month for having a wreath on our door past January 1st. A wreath. My son is deployed overseas, and that wreath has a yellow ribbon on it. I keep it up year-round because he's been gone for 8 months, and it makes me feel like he's still part of our home. She told me it was seasonal decoration overstay and needed to come down immediately. Did you take it down? I asked. Absolutely not. I told her if she touched my wreath, I'd file harassment charges. She backed off, but she's been giving us dirty looks ever since. Patricia took my clipboard. Where do I sign? Actually, give me that. I'll get you the 3 signatures you need by tonight. I'm in a book club with half this street. Patricia was as good as her word. By 9 that evening, she'd texted me photos of 3 more signature pages, neatly filled out and dated. We had 32 signatures total, well over our minimum requirement. The next morning, I drafted a formal letter citing the exact HOA covenant sections that allowed homeowners to call a special election. Marcus proofread it for grammar and tone. Jennifer made sure the legal language was correct based on her brother-in-law, who was a paralegal, and Robert formatted it to look official. We printed it on good paper, had all 32 homeowners sign it, and hand-delivered it to Linda Carmichael's house at 6 p.m. on Friday evening. I volunteered to be the one to actually knock on her door. The others waited in Robert's car at the curb, moral support in case things got ugly. Linda answered wearing a cream-colored sweater set and pearls, like she was hosting a dinner party rather than sitting at home on a Friday night. Her expression went from neutral to cold when she saw me. Frank, what do you want? I'm here to deliver a formal petition on behalf of 32 homeowners in Meadowbrook Heights. I handed her the envelope. We're calling for a special election to review your position as HOA president, as is our right under Section 15.2 of the Covenant. Linda took the envelope like it might bite her, opened it, and scanned the first page. I watched the color drain from her face, then return as angry red blotches on her cheeks. This is absurd. People can't just decide they don't like rules and remove board members. Actually, We can when board members don't follow the proper procedures outlined in the covenant. You've been issuing fines without warnings, without photographic evidence, and without allowing residents their right to contest violations before a review board. That's not enforcing rules, Linda. That's abusing your position. Those people violated clearly written codes. Show me the photographs. Show me the documentation that you followed proper procedure. Show me where any of us were offered a warning or a hearing. I kept my voice level, but I let her see the anger in my eyes. You can't, because you didn't. You've been running this neighborhood like your personal fiefdom, and people are tired of it. Linda's mouth opened and closed, searching for a response. Finally, she managed, "The board will review this petition at our next meeting. The covenant says you have to schedule a special election within 30 days of receiving a valid petition. This is valid. 30 days, Linda." I turned to walk away, then paused. "Oh, and I hope your car battery's been working better. Would hate for you to get stuck in this cold without any helpful neighbors around." It was petty, but it felt good. The next 4 weeks were intense. Linda fought back hard, sending out a mass email to all homeowners claiming that a small group of disgruntled residents were trying to undermine the established order and rules that keep our property values high. She held an emergency town hall at the community center, which backfired spectacularly when 75 people showed up, and spent 2 hours airing grievances about every petty citation and ridiculous fine she'd issued over the past 2 years. I sat in the back with Robert and watched Linda try to maintain control as resident after resident stood up to complain. Mrs. Patterson described being fined for having her garage door open too long while she unloaded groceries in the snow. A young couple with twins talked about being cited for having a play structure that was 6 inches too tall, according to some obscure regulation. A man I didn't know well, David something, explained that he'd been fined for parking his work van in his driveway overnight, even though he owned a plumbing business and needed his equipment accessible for emergency calls. "What am I supposed to do, rent storage?" David asked, his voice rising with frustration. "That's $300 a month because Linda doesn't like looking at a white van with my business name on it." Linda tried to explain that commercial vehicles lowered property values, but she was drowned out by angry muttering from the crowd. The other board members, Vice President Richard Moore and Secretary Donna Fletcher, sat beside Linda looking increasingly uncomfortable. Richard kept glancing at the crowd like he wanted to disappear, and Donna was taking notes with shaking hands. The meeting eventually devolved into chaos, and Linda abruptly adjourned it, gathering her papers and fleeing to her Lexus while people were still shouting questions. I saw her face as she passed my row, and she looked genuinely shaken. Part of me felt bad for about 30 seconds. Then I remembered the orange envelopes and the $100 fines for warming up my truck, and the sympathy evaporated. The special election was scheduled for a Saturday in mid-March. The temperature had finally climbed above freezing, and the massive snow piles in everyone's yards were slowly shrinking. We'd nominated Robert Chen to run against Linda for HOA president, figuring his calm demeanor and work-from-home schedule made him ideal. Robert had been reluctant at first, but Jennifer convinced him by pointing out that someone reasonable needed to step up, or we'd just end up with another Linda. The election was held at the community center, with voting open from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. I voted at 10, right after I finished my morning coffee. The ballot was simple: retain Linda Carmichael as HOA president or elect Robert Chen. There was also a separate measure to ratify changes to the enforcement procedures, requiring warnings before fines, photographic evidence of violations, and a proper review process. By noon, the parking lot was packed. I'd never seen this much engagement in neighborhood politics, but apparently, Linda had pissed off enough people that they were willing to give up a Saturday to vote her out. I hung around the community center, not officially doing anything but available if people had questions. Tom Harrison was doing the same, chatting with neighbors and occasionally sending someone over to me if they wanted details about what had prompted all this. Linda arrived at 2 p.m. with Richard and Donna in tow. They looked like they were attending a funeral. Linda's face was drawn and tight, her usual perfect makeup unable to hide the dark circles under her eyes. She cast her vote quickly and tried to leave, but she got cornered near the door by Patricia Walsh. I was too far away to hear the whole conversation, but Patricia's body language was clear. She was giving Linda a piece of her mind, gesturing emphatically while Linda stood frozen. Eventually, George Walsh appeared and gently guided his wife away, patting Linda's shoulder once in what might have been sympathy. Linda practically ran to her car. The votes were counted at 6 p.m. by a neutral party, a lawyer named Susan Greenfield, who lived in the neighborhood, but had somehow avoided being cited by Linda, probably because she worked 80 hours a week and was never home. A crowd of about 60 people gathered for the announcement, way more than I'd expected. Susan stood at the front of the community center meeting room and cleared her throat. "Okay, folks. Out of 147 eligible voters, we had 103 ballots cast. That's a 70% turnout, which is exceptional for an HOA election." There were murmurs of agreement. Susan continued, "For the measure to reform enforcement procedures, 98 yes votes, 5 no votes. The measure passes." Applause broke out. I felt my shoulders relax a notch. For HOA president, Robert Chen received 86 votes. Linda Carmichael received 17 votes. Robert Chen is the new HOA president, effective immediately. The applause was deafening. Robert looked stunned, like he hadn't quite believed this would actually happen. Jennifer hugged him. Tom shook his hand vigorously, and Marcus clapped him on the back hard enough to make him stumble. I made my way over and offered my congratulations. "You've got your work cut out for you," I told him. "No kidding. First order of business is rescinding all those bullshit fines." Robert was grinning despite looking overwhelmed. Linda had not stayed for the announcement. According to Patricia, who had eyes everywhere, Linda had left shortly after voting and hadn't been seen since. Her house was dark when I drove past that evening, curtains drawn tight against the world. I felt a strange mix of triumph and something that might have been pity. Linda had brought this on herself with her petty tyranny and power trips, but it still had to hurt to be rejected that decisively by your neighbors. Then again, she'd had 2 years to learn that cooperation worked better than dictatorial rule, and she'd chosen her path. The following week, Robert called an emergency board meeting and invited anyone who wanted to attend. About 30 people showed up, including me, curious to see how things would be different. Richard Moore had resigned from his vice president position via email, apparently wanting nothing to do with the controversy. Donna Fletcher stayed on as secretary, but looked relieved to have new leadership. Robert's first official act was to void all fines issued in the past 6 months that hadn't followed proper procedure. That included my $200, Tom's $150, Jennifer's $200, and about 40 other citations totaling nearly $8,000 in fines. The collective sigh of relief in that room was palpable. His second act was to propose a complete review of the HOA rules, specifically targeting outdated or overly restrictive regulations that served no legitimate purpose. The garden gnome rule was immediately struck. The limitations on garage door open times were revised to something reasonable. The commercial vehicle ban was modified to allow work vehicles for residents who owned businesses, with some basic size and appearance standards to prevent someone from parking a semi-truck in their driveway. The third and most important change was the creation of a proper review board for violations. Before any fine could be issued, a resident would receive a warning with photographic evidence. If the violation continued, they could request a hearing before a 3-person panel of randomly selected homeowners who would determine if the fine was appropriate. It wasn't perfect, but it was a hell of a lot better than Linda's unilateral judgment. I thought that was the end of it. The HOA drama had concluded, normalcy would return, and I could go back to warming up my truck in peace. But life had other plans. 3 weeks after the election, on an unseasonably warm Tuesday in early April, I came home from work to find 2 police cars parked in front of Linda Carmichael's house. My stomach dropped, and I immediately thought the worst, that something had happened to Linda, that maybe the stress and humiliation had pushed her to do something drastic. I parked in my driveway and walked over, where a small crowd of neighbors had gathered at a respectful distance. Robert was there, looking concerned. Patricia and George Walsh stood together, Patricia clutching George's arm. I joined them and asked what was happening. "Not sure yet," George said quietly. "Police showed up about 20 minutes ago, went inside, came out with some boxes, then went back in." As we watched, 2 officers emerged from Linda's front door carrying file boxes and what looked like a laptop. Linda followed, not in handcuffs but clearly distressed, talking rapidly to a female officer who was taking notes. The officer said something. Linda shook her head vigorously, and the conversation continued. Eventually, one of the officers noticed the gathering crowd and walked over. His name tag read Officer Martinez, and he had the patient expression of someone used to dealing with neighborhood disputes. "Folks, please head back to your homes. This is an ongoing investigation and we need to keep the area clear." "Is Linda okay?" Patricia asked, her voice tight with concern despite their wreath incident. "Miss Carmichael is fine." "We're not at liberty to discuss details right now, but there's no danger to the community." Officer Martinez's tone was professional but firm. We dispersed slowly, everyone throwing glances back at Linda's house. I went inside but couldn't focus on anything. I kept peeking out my window, watching the police cars, wondering what the hell was going on. This had to be connected to the HOA situation somehow, but how? What could Linda have done that warranted police involvement? The answer came the next morning via the neighborhood gossip chain, which operated faster than any official communication system. Jennifer called me at 7 a.m., her voice urgent. "Frank, have you heard? Linda was embezzling money from the HOA funds, like a lot of money." I sat down heavily on my couch, coffee mug frozen halfway to my lips. "What?" "Robert got access to the HOA bank accounts yesterday as part of his transition to president. He noticed some irregularities, withdrawals that didn't match any approved expenses, transfers to an account he didn't recognize. He called Susan Greenfield, the lawyer, and she told him to contact the police immediately." "How much money are we talking about?" "They think around $40,000 over the past 2 years. She was using the fine money, mostly, depositing checks, but then transferring portions to her personal account. She also approved contractor expenses for landscaping and maintenance that never actually happened. Just fake invoices she created and then paid herself." I felt sick. $40,000. That was serious criminal fraud, embezzlement, theft. Linda hadn't just been a petty tyrant with a power complex, she'd been actively stealing from the neighborhood. The police are treating it as felony theft, Jennifer continued. Susan said Linda could be looking at prison time if they prove everything. Over the next few weeks, the full scope of Linda's crimes emerged. She'd started small, apparently, just pocketing a few $100s here and there from fine payments. But as she issued more and more citations, often for increasingly ridiculous violations, the amounts grew. She'd also invented maintenance issues that required immediate contractor attention, then created fake invoices from shell companies and transferred HOA funds to accounts she controlled. The truly audacious part was that she'd been good at covering her tracks good enough that the other board members hadn't noticed, anyway. Richard Moore and Donna Fletcher were questioned by police, but cleared of wrongdoing. They'd been rubber stamping Linda's decisions without actually reviewing the financial details, which was negligent but not criminal. Robert, as the new president, had to work with Susan Greenfield and the police to untangle the finances and figure out exactly how much was missing. The final tally was $43,600, stolen over 26 months. It worked out to about $300 per household that Linda had essentially stolen. The county prosecutor charged Linda with multiple counts of theft, fraud, and embezzlement. Her arraignment was scheduled for late May. In the meantime, she'd been released on bail with conditions that included surrendering her passport and not contacting any Meadowbrook Heights residents. Linda's house went up for sale in mid-April. I never saw her again after that day with the police cars. According to Patricia, who had connections at the real estate office, Linda had moved in with her sister in Bozeman and was trying to sell the house quickly. It sat empty and dark, a stark reminder of how badly things can go when unchecked power meets moral weakness. The neighborhood slowly returned to normal, though the scandal provided gossip fuel for months. Robert proved to be an excellent HOA president, responsive, reasonable, and transparent about finances. He set up a quarterly newsletter that detailed every dollar spent and held open meetings where residents could voice concerns. It was the complete opposite of Linda's regime. In early June, as the Montana weather finally committed to being warm and pleasant, I was in my driveway working on my truck's oil change when Tom Harrison walked over with 2 beers. "Figured you could use a cold one," Tom said, handing me a bottle. I gratefully accepted, wiping grease from my hands with an old rag. We sat on my driveway in lawn chairs, enjoying the evening sun and the distinct lack of HOA drama. "You know, I never properly thanked you," Tom said after a while, "for starting this whole thing. If you hadn't stood up to Linda about those warming up the truck fines, she'd still be running roughshod over everyone and stealing our money. I just got fed up. Could have been anyone. But it wasn't anyone. It was you." Tom clinked his bottle against mine. "To being a pain in the ass when it matters." I laughed and drank to that. Linda's trial was scheduled for August. The prosecutor's office had reached out to multiple residents to serve as witnesses about the pattern of improper fines and citations, which established Linda's modus operandi for generating money to steal. I was one of those witnesses, along with Jennifer, Tom, Mrs. Patterson, and about a dozen others. When the trial date arrived, I took a personal day from work and drove to the Yellowstone County Courthouse in downtown Billings. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with wood paneling and fluorescent lights that gave everything a slightly depressing tinge. Linda sat at the defendant's table with her lawyer, a tired-looking man in his 50s who kept shuffling papers and whispering to her. Linda had changed. She'd lost weight, and not in a healthy way. Her blonde bob was grown out and streaked with gray. The pastel sweater sets were gone, replaced by a dark blue dress that hung loose on her frame. She looked diminished, like someone had taken the Linda I knew and created a faded photocopy. I felt that weird pang of sympathy again, stronger this time. Then the prosecutor began laying out the evidence, and the sympathy faded. Bank records showing the transfers. The fake invoices Linda had created using a desktop publishing program. Testimony from residents about the absurd fines. The pattern was undeniable and damning. My turn to testify came on the second day. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Amanda Wright, walked me through the timeline of my 2 violations: warming up my truck and the frosted windows fine. She had me explain the temperature that week, the necessity of warming vehicles in Montana winters, and Linda's failure to follow proper HOA procedures. And what happened when you attempted to help Miss Carmichael with her dead battery shortly after receiving your first citation? Amanda asked. I declined to assist her, I said, keeping my voice steady. She'd just fined me $100 for warming up my truck on a -8-degree morning. When she flagged me down because her battery died, I told her I couldn't help because I didn't want to create noise pollution or security risks, the exact reasons she'd cited in my violation notice. There was a ripple of reaction through the courtroom, a mix of amusement and approval. Linda's lawyer objected to something, but the judge overruled it. Did Miss Carmichael's citation follow the HOA covenant procedures for first-time violations? No. According to the covenant, first-time Category C violations require a written warning, not a fine. She skipped that step entirely. Amanda introduced my citation as evidence, along with a dozen others that showed the same pattern. Linda's lawyer tried to cross-examine me, suggesting that I was biased or had a personal vendetta, but I stuck to the facts. The citations were improper. The procedures weren't followed. Linda had been generating fine revenue improperly, which she then stole. The trial lasted 5 days total. The evidence was overwhelming. Linda's lawyer tried to argue that she'd been under financial stress. Her divorce 3 years earlier had left her in debt. Her early retirement hadn't provided as much income as she'd expected, and she'd made poor choices, but never meant real harm. It was a sympathy play that fell flat, especially after the prosecutor showed that Linda had used some of the stolen money for a Caribbean cruise and a new Lexus. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours, guilty on all counts. Sentencing came 3 weeks later, in late September, as the Montana weather was starting its inevitable slide back toward winter. Linda was sentenced to 4 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 2 if she showed good behavior and made restitution. She was also ordered to pay back the full $43,600, plus legal fees and court costs. Her house had sold by then, and the proceeds went toward restitution, though it wasn't enough to cover everything. I didn't attend the sentencing. I'd done my part, testified truthfully, and I didn't need to see Linda's face as she was led away in handcuffs. According to Robert, who did attend, Linda had read a brief statement apologizing to the neighborhood but didn't elaborate or try to justify her actions. She'd looked resigned, like she'd finally accepted the consequences of her choices. The HOA received about $30,000 in restitution from Linda's house sale and remaining assets. Robert and the new board voted to distribute it back to homeowners as a credit against future HOA dues. It worked out to about $200 per household, not everything Linda had stolen, but something. Life in Meadowbrook Heights genuinely improved after Linda's departure. Robert's leadership style was collaborative rather than dictatorial. The reformed enforcement procedures meant that violations were handled reasonably. The commercial vehicle policy change meant David the plumber could park his van in his driveway without harassment. Mrs. Patterson kept her yellow ribbon wreath up year-round, and no one said a word. In November, as I was warming up my truck one frigid morning before work, Tom Harrison pulled up next to me in his F-150, also idling in his driveway. We waved to each other, both of us grinning at the simple freedom to stay warm without fear of orange envelopes and arbitrary fines. Patricia Walsh organized a neighborhood Christmas party at the community center in December, the first social event we'd had in years that wasn't contentious. People actually wanted to gather and celebrate together, which said everything about how toxic Linda's presence had been. I brought a case of beer and stayed for 3 hours, chatting with neighbors I'd barely known before all this started. Robert pulled me aside at one point, beer in hand, and said, "You know the ironic thing about all this? If Linda had just been reasonable, if she'd given you a warning instead of an immediate fine, if she'd followed the actual rules instead of making up her own, we never would have looked into anything. She'd probably still be president, still stealing money, and we'd all be miserable without knowing why. Sometimes the worst thing you can do is piss off someone who's just trying to live their life," I said. Robert laughed and raised his beer. "To Linda Carmichael, who taught us all the importance of proper procedure and checks on authority. And to dead batteries," I added, "may they always happen to people who deserve them." We drank to that, and the party continued around us, warm and loud and full of people who'd learned that standing together against petty tyranny was worth the effort. The following spring, I got a letter in the mail from the Montana Department of Corrections. Linda Carmichael had been transferred to the Women's Correctional Facility in Billings and was enrolled in financial literacy and ethics courses as part of her rehabilitation. The letter was a form notification sent to victims of her crimes, updating us on her status. I read it once and filed it away, not sure how I felt about it. Part of me hoped Linda would genuinely learn from this experience and come out better on the other side. Part of me was still angry about the stress and hassle she'd caused over something as simple as warming up a truck. Mostly, though, I felt relieved that it was over and life had returned to normal. In May, nearly a year after the election that changed everything, Robert's term as HOA president came up for renewal. He'd agreed to serve 1 year initially, and there was some question about whether he'd continue. At the annual meeting, held on a pleasant Saturday afternoon at the community center, someone nominated Jennifer Kowalski to run against him. Jennifer declined, stating that Robert was doing a great job and should continue. No one else stepped forward. Robert was re-elected by acclamation, meaning unanimous approval without a formal vote. It was a stark contrast to the contentious special election that had ousted Linda. After the meeting, as people were gathering their things and chatting, Marcus Webb, the high school teacher who'd first suggested reviewing the HOA covenants, came over to me. "I've been thinking about writing up this whole experience as a case study for my government class," Marcus said. "How small-scale civic engagement can actually make a difference, the importance of understanding governing documents, the consequences of unchecked authority. Would you be okay with me interviewing you for it?" "Sure," I said, "as long as you change the names. I don't need to be famous for getting into a fight with my HOA president." Marcus grinned. "Deal. Though honestly, you should be proud. Most people just complain and pay the fine. You actually did something about it." I thought about that on the drive home. I'd never set out to be some kind of neighborhood activist or hero. I'd just been a guy who was tired of being harassed for warming up his truck in sub-zero weather. The fact that it had uncovered Linda's embezzlement scheme and led to criminal charges was almost accidental, a side effect of standing up for basic fairness. But Marcus was right that it mattered. If I just paid those fines and moved on, Linda would have continued escalating. More absurd rules, more improper citations, more stolen money. Eventually, it might have imploded anyway, but how much worse would it have gotten first? How many more people would have been stressed and harassed and robbed? That summer was one of the most pleasant I'd experienced in Meadowbrook Heights. The neighborhood felt genuinely friendly for the first time since I'd moved in. People waved to each other, stopped to chat in driveways, organized impromptu barbecues. Patricia Walsh's book club expanded to include a dozen members. David the plumber started a neighborhood handyman exchange where people could trade skills. He'd fix your leaky faucet if you'd help him with landscaping. That sort of thing. Robert organized a neighborhood yard sale in July, with proceeds going to a local charity. It was held on a Saturday morning, and nearly every house participated. I sold some old tools and furniture I'd been meaning to get rid of and walked away with $60 and a sense of community I'd been missing without realizing it. In August, I was at the hardware store picking up supplies when I ran into Donna Fletcher, Linda's former secretary on the HOA board. We hadn't spoken since the scandal broke, though I knew she'd cooperated fully with the investigation and hadn't been charged with anything. "Frank, hi," Donna said, looking uncertain about whether I'd be friendly. "Hey, Donna, how are you doing?" "Better. I wanted to apologize, actually. I should have been paying more attention to what Linda was doing. I signed off on things without really reviewing them, and I feel terrible about it." "You weren't the one stealing money," I pointed out. "And from what I heard, Linda was good at keeping people in the dark. Still, I was in a position to catch it and didn't." Donna shifted her shopping basket from one hand to the other. "I'm glad Robert's doing such a good job, and I'm glad you pushed back when Linda went too far. Someone needed to." We chatted for a few more minutes before parting ways. The encounter stuck with me, though. Donna had been complicit through negligence rather than malice, and she clearly felt guilty about it. It was a good reminder that most people weren't intentionally bad, they just didn't pay attention until something forced them to. September arrived with cooler temperatures and the first hints of fall color in the trees. One evening, I was sitting on my front porch with a beer when Robert walked over from his house. "Got a minute?" Robert asked. "Sure, want a beer, always." Robert settled into the chair next to me with the cold bottle I retrieved from my fridge. "I wanted to give you a heads up about something. Linda's up for parole review next month." My hand tightened on my beer bottle. "She's only served a year." "Yeah, but apparently she's been a model prisoner. Completed all her rehabilitation courses, no disciplinary issues, strong recommendations from the prison staff. The parole board will decide whether she's released early with conditions. Are they asking for victim statements or anything? They are. Letters supporting or opposing parole. I wanted to make sure you knew in case you wanted to submit something." Robert took a long drink of his beer. "Personally, I don't think I'm going to submit anything. She's served time, she's done the programs, and keeping her locked up another year won't change what happened." "What about the restitution? She still owes, what, 10,000? Closer to 13, actually. But that continues regardless of whether she's in prison or out. In fact, she's probably more likely to pay it back if she's released and can actually work." I considered this. Linda had committed crimes and deserved punishment, which she'd received. She'd paid back most of what she'd stolen and was working on the rest. Keeping her in prison out of spite didn't serve any real purpose, and I wasn't a vindictive person by nature. "I'm not going to submit anything either," I said finally. "She's not a threat to anyone and she's paid for what she did. If the parole board thinks she's ready, that's their call. Robert nodded, looking relieved. That's what I figured, but I wanted to check. Jennifer feels the same way. Tom's on the fence, but I think he'll end up abstaining too. Linda was released on parole in late October after serving 14 months of her 4-year sentence. The conditions included 3 years of supervised probation, continued restitution payments, and a restriction that she couldn't serve on any HOA board or in any financial management position. She didn't return to Billings. According to the neighborhood gossip chain, which never fully shut down, Linda had moved to Spokane, Washington to live near her daughter and had gotten a job as a receptionist at a dental office. I thought about her sometimes, wondering if she genuinely learned from the experience or if she just regretted getting caught. I hoped it was the former, but I'd never know for sure. Life continued in Meadowbrook Heights, quieter and more pleasant without the constant drama. The HOA functioned the way it was supposed to, handling necessary maintenance, enforcing reasonable rules, and staying out of people's lives otherwise. Robert served as president for another 2 years before passing the role to Marcus Webb, who brought his teacher's organizational skills to the position. I still warmed up my truck every winter morning, and no one ever said a word about it. Tom Harrison and I developed a system where we'd text each other on particularly cold mornings, truck warming party, my driveway, 7 a.m., as a joke that never got old. Sometimes Robert would join us, all 3 trucks idling in a row while we drank coffee and complained about the weather in the way Montanans do, like it's a personal affront, but also a point of pride. The orange violation envelopes disappeared entirely. When actual violations occurred, someone leaving trash bins out for days, or a broken fence that needed repair, the new system worked smoothly. Warning notice with photo evidence, opportunity to fix it, review board hearing if needed. It was fair and reasonable, and people responded accordingly. I learned something important from the whole experience. Most people will tolerate a lot of nonsense to avoid conflict, but there's a breaking point where standing up becomes necessary. For me, that point was $200 in fines for warming up my truck and having frost on my windows. It seemed petty in hindsight, but it had led to uncovering genuine crimes and improving life for 147 households. Sometimes the small battles matter more than you think. Years later, I was at a construction industry conference in Bozeman when I saw Linda across the lobby. She was with a group of people, laughing at something someone said, looking healthier and more relaxed than I'd ever seen her. Our eyes met for a brief second, and I saw recognition flash across her face. She gave a small nod, almost apologetic, and I nodded back. Then she turned away, and that was it. I didn't approach her, and she didn't approach me. There was nothing to say, really. We'd both played our parts in a drama that had changed both our lives, though in very different ways. She'd paid her debt to society and was building a new life. I'd learned that community engagement sometimes means standing up to people in authority, even when it's uncomfortable. Back in Meadowbrook Heights, the community center had a plaque installed in the meeting room, commemorating the 2025 HOA reform. It didn't mention Linda by name, just noted that resident advocacy led to improved governance procedures and stronger community bonds. Robert had pushed for the plaque, wanting to remind future residents that they had power and voice in how their neighborhood was run. I thought about my old neighbor in my previous apartment, an elderly man named Walter who'd served in local government for decades. He'd once told me, "Democracy is a participatory sport. You get what you put into it, and if you sit on the sidelines, don't complain when the game goes badly." I hadn't fully understood that then, but I did now. The HOA was the smallest possible form of democratic governance, and it required the same vigilance and engagement as any other system. When people checked out and let one person run everything without oversight, bad things happened. When people paid attention and held leaders accountable, things improved. My involvement in the HOA didn't end with Linda's removal. I served on the review board for violations, attended monthly meetings when I could, and generally stayed informed about what was happening. It wasn't glamorous or exciting, but it mattered. It kept us from sliding back into the kind of petty tyranny that had made everyone miserable. On cold winter mornings, when I started my truck early and let it idle while I finished my coffee inside, I sometimes thought about Linda and her orange violation envelopes. I thought about how differently things might have gone if she'd just been reasonable, if she'd followed the rules she was supposed to enforce, if she'd seen herself as a steward of the community rather than its ruler. But she hadn't, and her choices had consequences that rippled through the entire neighborhood. My choice to push back had consequences, two better ones, I believed, though they'd taken effort and discomfort to achieve. In the end, the story of the HOA fine for warming my vehicle became neighborhood legend, told with various embellishments at parties and gatherings. Some versions had me dramatically confronting Linda in the street. Others had her caught red-handed with bags of cash. The truth was more mundane but no less important. I'd gotten fed up with unreasonable rules, refused to help someone who'd been unreasonable to me, and started asking questions that needed asking. The fact that those questions uncovered embezzlement and led to criminal charges was almost beside the point. The real victory was creating a system where one person couldn't abuse their position without accountability, where rules had to make sense and be applied fairly, and where residents felt empowered to speak up when things went wrong. And that victory meant I could warm up my truck on cold Montana mornings without fear of harassment, which had been the goal all along. Sometimes the simplest goals require the most complicated journeys, but they're worth it when you arrive. The neighborhood thrived under better leadership, people were happier, and property values actually increased, the ironic opposite of what Linda had claimed would happen if her strict rules weren't enforced. Turns out people preferred living somewhere reasonable and friendly over somewhere with rigid enforcement of arbitrary regulations. Who knew? Everyone except Linda, apparently. As I sit here now, several years after those orange envelopes first appeared on my windshield, I can honestly say I don't regret any of it. The stress, the confrontation, the time spent in courtrooms and meetings, all of it was worth it for the community we built afterward. Robert remained a good friend, someone I could count on for anything. The neighbors who'd been strangers became genuine friends, united by shared experience and the knowledge that we'd stood together when it mattered. And my truck. It still warms up every winter morning, running smoothly in the cold Montana air, ready for whatever the day brings. No orange envelopes, no harassment, no drama. Just a truck getting warm, exactly as it should be. Linda Carmichael taught me an important lesson, though not the one she intended. Sometimes the best thing you can do for your community is refuse to go along with unreasonable demands, ask hard questions, and trust that other people feel the same way you do. They usually do. They're just waiting for someone to make the first move. I happen to be that someone, all because I wanted to warm up my truck without getting fined. And because of that small, petty annoyance, an entire neighborhood became a better place to live. Life works in strange ways sometimes, turning personal frustration into collective action, and making heroes out of people who just wanted to be left alone. But that's democracy on the smallest scale, messy, uncomfortable, and absolutely necessary. The HOA of Meadowbrook Heights was better for the struggle, and I was better for having fought it. And on cold mornings, when I watch my neighbors' trucks idling in their driveways alongside mine, I smile and remember that sometimes standing up for yourself means standing up for everyone. That's worth any amount of orange envelopes.